Good afternoon. My name is Andrew Mirabella. I'm a senior consultant at Hemson Consulting Limited. The purpose of this presentation is to provide an overview of the water and wastewater rate study for the County of Oxford. Hemson was retained by the county to undertake a rate study and help assist with the preparation of utility rates for the period of 2021 through to 2024. The purpose of this meeting is to just give an interest on what the overall rate results are thus far, and some of the summary of options which we have presented, which will further facilitate the preparation and passage of a new bylaw at subsequent meeting from Council in the coming months. So just moving on to the next slide, we'll go through today with a few discussion points. We'll go through a bit of a background and the study objectives, why we were retained, provide a bit of an overview of the key inputs and assumptions associated with preparing the analysis. Then we'll get into the calculated rates. We've undertaken the analysis under two distinct scenarios being presented. One, maintaining your existing rate structure and what the rates would look like under that structure over the forthcoming period, and a subsequent study or subsequent scenario of what it would look like under an alternative rate structure. Then we'll look at the overview of results and comparative to some of the benchmarking analysis we've done with utility rates in similar and surrounding jurisdictions in both an urban and rural setting. So in terms of the background, the county has continued to adjust their water and wastewater user rates based on the study completed by Hemson in 2016. That study effectively set user rates for a 4-year period from 2017 through to 2020 via bylaw 5903/2017. Hemson was then retained to assist county staff in setting the water and wastewater user rates for the next 4 years from 2021 through to 2024. Effectively, these rates are intended to fund the projected expenditures and ensure sufficient funds are available to meet the asset management requirements. Overall, the rate objectives here is that we're ensuring that the county continues to fund all of its costs, and you're going to be putting away money into reserves for future asset repair and replacement. Those rate calculations have been really kind of set in targets considering the annual requirements and reserve fund policy targets considered through the county's asset management plan. Now, just to make sure that the county is going to be fiscally sustainable over the long term, we have extended our calculation model through to 2029 to ensure that each system remains sustainable beyond that 4-year period. Although we are looking at rates over the period from 2021 through 2024, we did want to make sure after that 2024 period, with the rates that we have, the county system continues to remain sustainable and sufficient funds are available in reserves to meet those requirements over the long term. So as we were involved in some of the preceding rate studies for the county, our role here also involved the refinement of the existing Excel-based calculation model. So we already had a really good model to start with, and we're going to continue to use that model for future rate setting exercise and monitor success. This model and this tool is effectively passed over to county staff again to continue on with that process going forward. As I mentioned in the preceding slides here, this study included the review of different rate structure scenarios, and 2 rate structure scenarios are really brought forward for council consideration here today. Scenario 1 is maintaining the existing system structure, while scenario 2 looks at harmonizing the 8 wastewater system, township system to one uniform structure, as well as consolidating the wastewater ICI rates into a uniform countywide rate. So really what we're looking at is the scenario 2 is solely related to the wastewater system and those small wastewater systems on there. So it does mirror more so the water structure that's currently in place under a township system. The second component to that is a kind of a second tier to that is the ICI rates are uniform countywide. Currently residential and non-residential are charged differently, and each ICI rate is dependent on each of the different systems, urban and rural. This would all now just kind of harmonize the ICIs all together into one consumption rates, but still on a tiered structure on the humpback rate structure. Just to be clear, this change would not result in any adjustments to the water structure under either scenario. The rate structure harmonization, rate structure option under scenario 2 is really solely focused on wastewater, and under either scenario, water remains as it is. So I think this slide provides a bit of a better overview of what's actually being proposed under the various scenarios. You see here on the wastewater scenario one, we have all the different service areas, your urban areas from Woodstock, Tillsonburg, and Ingersoll, down through Norwich through Innerkip from the smaller township systems. The fixed charge is levied independent by area, and then your consumption charge residentially is uniform across all service areas, while your ICI is actually independent by area for each service area. Under the scenario two and what's being proposed here under the alternative is that we have two fundamental changes. The first one being you have the service areas along the side. So Woodstock, Tillsonburg, and Ingersoll, your three urban areas. And then what we have is our township system. That township system consolidates the Norwich through Innerkip rate, so the 8 township systems into one overarching system rate. And you have there the fixed charges are continued to be levied independent by area, and your consumption charge is going to be charged still residentially, uniform across all service areas, but now your ICI charge again is going to be uniform across all service areas. Certainly when you do this type of approach and make this adjustment, as you can see, it's a little bit more simplistic and easier to administer and understand relative to the existing structure. And it does provide a little bit more continuity to the way things are currently levied on the water side, although albeit still a bit different from that structure. So just in terms of some of the key inputs, just looking at the forecast of future demand, how did we come up with the rates and some of the background that goes into it? Before we get into the future demand component, all the cost analysis has been provided by county staff, both operationally and capital budget wise, and those forecasts of projection of costs have all been incorporated into here. The forecast and the number of new connections is really based on a variety of different information sources. So we did review, historical connection information over the last 5 to 10 years. There was a recently completed growth outlook report by Hemson of April 2019, and discussions with county staff really framed how we looked at the number of new connections which are going to be on the system over the next 5 to 10 years. And again, really this report is solely focusing on the next 4 years, but the projection of new users is over the longer period, over the 10-year period. The second component, once we have an identification of the number of new connections, we then look at the forecast of future consumption patterns and how is that informed. And we really have a variety of, again, different information sources, and it really is different on the type of system. So we definitely used all the build water data from 2012 for the urban systems. We have much better data there. Meters have been in place for quite some time, while 2018 and 2019 data was used for the township systems where water meters were recently installed. So we did have to look at the trends from both urban and rural systems in order to help inform our analysis. What we've seen here is that billed water consumption effectively has been continued to decline, both on a per capita basis and on a per connection basis over the last number of years. I think that trend is very consistent with what we see in other municipalities across the province, really across the country. So we really wanted to make sure that that trend continues over the long term in this particular study. And what we also saw when we looked at both residential and non-residential data differently, the ICI operations continue to kind of adjust and also have a downward effect as well. They continue to streamline operations and increase conservation efforts. So those efforts cumulatively from the industrial, commercial, institutional sector has really continued to bring down overall per capita, per consumption trends overall and declining water trends. And that's again reflected in the analysis going forward. So just to get right into what the actual rates look like and what it means to a typical user, and that's under the scenario one option, what we have here. This reflects what the total bill would be for water and wastewater services for a household consuming 170 cubic meters per year. And what we have is the rates from a urban system perspective as well as a smaller systems perspective under the scenario one. This means that there's no change in the rate structure here. It's continuing under the existing regime. And we have the urban areas in orange, and you see there's really a kind of a few different ones that we want to kind of pinpoint here to bring out. The first one being the city of Woodstock's rate increases are about between 4.5% to 5% per annum, while other areas such as Ingersoll and Tavistock are actually seeing a reduction in the rates relative to the good fiscal standing some of those systems being currently in. Ingersoll seeing a decline in the rate in 2021 and Tavistock seeing a decline of about 9% in 2021. going forward, the rates would continue to increase in those particular systems, just to ensure that the cost maintained with the least effects of inflation and the cost increases which would be seen in those areas. Just on the one particular area in Woodstock, although we are seeing about 4 to 5% per annum rate increases, that does reflect only about $30 per year. And although again it's 5% per annum, it is on the lower end of the spectrum in terms of all the other areas in Oxford County in terms of the rates. So just to be cognizant of that from the overall perspective. Going forward in all the other areas but Woodstock, the rate increases are in and around between 1 and 2.5% going forward, obviously depending on each specific jurisdiction. The second scenario is about harmonizing the wastewater system and ICI consumption charges. And just to break down exactly what we've done in terms of the scenario here, the first component is harmonizing all 8 small township systems into one township wastewater system. So what we've done is we brought all systems in line with the lowest user rates currently in force, and then plus an additional reduction of 10% on the fixed charges. And we did this so that we see that an overall benefit on those small system users, so that when we try and harmonize the system, not one particular area is being adversely affected while the others benefit. Under this particular analysis, we are seeing the county would continue to generate sufficient funds to cover expenses, and your reserve funds would actually continue to grow. And again, just stressing that there's an overall benefit to all small township systems under this proposal under scenario 2. The second component, the second change, which is being brought about, as I mentioned earlier, is about the ICI consumption rates, and that's being brought in line with the lowest rates currently in force, being the city of Woodstock. So the wastewater residential and ICI charges would continue to be charged independently. However, the wastewater ICI rates now would be uniform across all systems, where currently they are charged independently relative to the service area. All the rates would be in line with the city of Woodstock, so certainly Tillsonburg and Ingersoll would benefit by having a reduction on their ICI rates, and Woodstock would not be affected as their rates are currently the lowest, and everyone would just be brought in line with their existing rates. So just to kind of graphically illustrate what that means, we have in scenario 2 summarizing the small wastewater harmonization change from a typical household in 2020 versus 2021. So just to show you, the 2020 bill is the bar in green, while your 2021 bill that's calculated is in gold. And that's reflective of the change that would be occurring under the scenario 2 under a rate structure change. Now, that being said, what we're seeing here is effectively an overall benefit for all the different smaller systems when we move to this rate structure harmonization option. The quantity, or the quantum of the rate change itself is different, obviously, relative to the individual service areas, relative to the rates that are currently in force in 2020. But generally speaking, when you see them, there's a lot of rate increases that a lot of service areas would see a benefit of 20% and upwards. And the lowest increase being in lowest change would be in Norwich, and Innerkip would be about 2 to 4%, but the remaining service areas would be upwards of 20%, where Jumbo is seeing the highest benefit, the greatest benefit, I guess you can say, of about a 33% decrease in their bill and about $515. So pretty substantial savings when we move to a harmonization structure. And again, the intention here was to move to a harmonized structure and still providing a benefit to all users under the system, which would be equal to everyone, under an equal billing system for everyone, I should say. So with that, scenario 2, the calculated annual typical household bill, what we're seeing here is very similar to the chart that was on the previous slide, but this is obviously relative to scenario 2. So a couple important points here. The urban areas are not affected by this rate structure change. So the same rates that we saw under scenario 1 would be applicable for scenario 2 under the urban areas of Woodstock, Tillsonburg, and Ingersoll. The second component of what I want to bring to the attention here is the rate changes in the smaller systems from Norwich down to Innerkip. And what we see here is in 2020, the rates being differentiated by service area, but what you will notice is that starting in 2021, the rates are the same, consistent across all service areas, as those are the harmonized rates. So the rates that we're calculating are uniform across all areas. And obviously the rate change from 2020 to 2021 is different by each service area. and the rate change is effectively different. But going forward, post 2021, the rate increases are about 1.6% per annum, moving up to about 1.8% by the end of the period. But we did want to make sure that although we're making a change in the first year from 2020 to 2021, going forward, the rate impacts are still less than 2% per year on a typical household. And importantly, I think for some of the areas, what we're seeing here, and just as an example, in Drumble, even by 2024, under the harmonized structure, the rate that one would pay in Drumble would be well less than what they were currently paying even in 2020. So certainly, again, illustrating the savings that would occur under this harmonized structure. So, given that there's some benefits here, we do want to illustrate some of the changes in the reserve fund balances and what that means to the systems on an individual basis and ensuring that there's sufficient money. And we put a lot of emphasis on this when we calculated the rates. So looking at the water reserve balances for scenario one, looking at all systems really, 2020 is your is your green bar, and 2024 is the rates, is the reserve funds that would be in place or projected at least by the end of the planning period of the 4 years under this analysis. And you see that even with some of the rate increases that we're seeing in places such as Woodstock, we're actually seeing a decline in our reserve funds through in 2024. That being said, we have looked at the analysis over a longer term planning period, and those reserve funds do begin to build back up. There's significant capital in the first coming years, which is drawing upon those reserves. All the other areas of Tillsonburg, we see an increase. Ingersoll, there's a reduction in the reserves, and Township Water, there's a reduction in the reserves. But again, over the long term, continues to remain sustainable, as there's some capital projects which are drawing upon those funds in the first parts of the planning period. Under the wastewater, we're looking at the urban systems here. There is, again, fairly sustainable systems. All the reserves are positive. Your Woodstock and Tillsonburg reserves actually increase over the 4-year period. And there's obviously it appears to be a significant increase in the Ingersoll wastewater reserve fund. Although despite the significant increase that we're seeing from 2020 to 2024, we are still trying to achieve our asset management targets, which we are still short of at that 4-year planning period. So which indicates there are significant capital expenditures in the future in Ingersoll, which we need to be cognizant of and saving for at this particular time. On slide 13, we have the wastewater reserve balances and then the comparison of scenarios 1 and scenario 2. And really what we're looking at here is just trying to quantify, we really are showing some savings from an overall perspective by shifting to a harmonized structure under scenario 2, and I'm trying to quantify what that actually means here. And our green bars is our 2020 reserve, our gold bars is our scenario 1 2024 reserve, and scenario 2 is our light gray 2024 reserve fund. And what we see is that under, Woodstock, Tillsonburg, and Ingersoll, our scenario 2 is virtually unchanged. There's some minor reduction in Tillsonburg and Ingersoll as a result of moving or shifting to harmonizing the ICI rates, and we're absorbing that through the reserve funds. But really what's important is the township ones, and that's a result of the harmonization structure. So the gold bars is effectively just a sum of all the individual reserve funds on a service area basis from when the rates are levied independently there. But the gray bars is actually looking at what the harmonized reserve fund would be. So really what we're trying to say here is that even under giving those benefits to all those individual users by harmonizing the rates, we are still very much in a positive position at the 2024 period, and only modestly less than what the reserve funds are currently at in 2020. So even with those providing that benefit corporate-wide, in order to harmonize those systems, we are still very much in a positive situation at the end of the 4-year period, and those service areas continue to be sustainable under that structure. So just to provide a bit of a summary here of that scenario 2, and I feel like I've touched upon this quite a bit already. I think the one part here is obviously just the overarching point. I think the past practice here has really left the county in a pretty good fiscal position, which would allow the county to use existing township reserve funds to mitigate the shift of harmonizing the small systems. And even with that, us managing the existing reserves, going forward, you continue to generate sufficient funds to cover expenses and meet your asset management requirements. So we can make a one-time adjustment in order to do this, and then going forward, we would continue to be in a positive position and grow our reserve funds, and it allows the county to be flexible going forward. The rate harmonization focuses largely on your small wastewater systems. Ingersoll and Tillsonburg wastewater ICI rates in 2021 would be reduced relative to the current 2020 bylaw rates. And again, just stressing the urban system residential users are not affected from harmonization, nor are the Woodstock ICI users. So it's very isolated in terms of some of the changes that are actually occurring. And largely your residential urban systems are not affected. And again, your Woodstock ICI users are also not affected. So it's some positives from the perspective in terms of limiting the urban area residential users. So just in terms of what does that mean from putting in perspective those users from a typical household in the urban areas under scenarios 1 and scenario 2 relative to other comparing urban area communities from London through to Cambridge, what those rates mean. And I guess there's a couple important points here. Woodstock, as I noted in some of the earlier slides, we're seeing an increase of about 5% in this particular planning period in 2021. Even with that 5% increase, we are still the lowest, let's say Woodstock remains the lowest in the comparing communities by about $60 relative to London, and obviously much lower than some of the likes of those in Kitchener and Cambridge. Tillsonburg and Ingersoll, Tillsonburg remains kind of in the middle of the pack, and Ingersoll remains kind of still quite competitive, but on the higher end of the spectrum relative to some of the other communities after the rates have been enforced. And again, this reflects the scenario 1 and scenario 2. The urban areas residential users are going to be the same under either scenario 1 and scenario 2. So that's what's illustrated here. From a municipal comparison of a typical household for more of the rural systems, we have the communities from North Perth through to Middlesex Center, and the range of the increase of about $970 to $1,590 up in Middlesex Center. And you see the rate, the gold bars here representing the scenario 1 rates for each individual system. Under scenario 1, again, everyone is charged independently, consistent with the current structure, but in scenario 2, the township system is harmonized, and that's what's shown there. And under the harmonized structure, you see there's obviously a fairly significant decline or discount from the rates from all the existing users. And again, certain areas such as Drumbo or Mount Elgin would see the biggest benefit of that. And the 1051 would be quite competitive with all the surrounding rural area systems, and actually on the lower end of the spectrum, higher than North Perth, but less than Chatham-Kent, Wellesley, Norfolk County, and etc. So just as an overarching point, again, the harmonization of the system would reduce the rates for the township systems and kind of make it, again, still competitive and quite competitive with your surrounding jurisdictions. So aside from some of those other fee rate increases in the fee projections that we've identified, there are a few other key important points that we want to bring forward here as part of this process. And the first one is really an important point. So the CSAP program is not being reintroduced at this particular time, and the source water protection charge has actually is proposed to be discontinued. And just as a note, the source water protection charge represents a flat charge per month. And when you actually take that flat charge per month, it actually represents, just in the context of, again, looking at the city of Woodstock, which had about a 5% increase per annum, it represents about half that increase per year. So it really makes a reduction in terms of what the total impact on the total bill would be, because those impacts that we showed did not include source water protection. So certainly some of those increases can be absorbed by the fact that some of those charges that are currently being levied, such as source water protection, are actually going to be discontinued. And those CSAP program are not going to actually be reintroduced. So again, further savings to county user rates. The second point here, county staff proposed to eliminate the Tillsonburg sewer property tax levy. So that represents about $440,000 in budget revenue in 2020. That's a separate tax that's levied independent of the user rates, and that is proposed to be eliminated through this process. And that's something that, again, a benefit to the users in the town of Tillsonburg. Again, just stressing the Ingersoll water and Tavistock wastewater fixed charge has actually been reduced to reflect the good fiscal standings of the systems. And those are two systems on an independent basis are actually seeing the reduction in 2021, as I noted in the previous slide. And again, that's just a function of the good standing and the reduction in the fixed charge, which we've shown. There's a consolidation of the monthly flat fee and special circumstance customers into one rate. It's still calculated relative to each independent system, and the basis for the calculation is the fixed charge plus the volumetric rate equal to 15 cubic meters per month. There's an updated penalty flat rate, and that's calculated double the monthly flat fee for special circumstance rates. And then there's also a new construction water rate is being introduced to be charged at the fixed rate that matches the pipe size for development and the consumption equal to 15 cubic meters per month. That particular construction water rate is a new fee, and it's very tough to determine what the I guess the quantum of the revenue is. It's certainly a rate that would be put in place only if it's needed, and I think the intention is that at any time it's required, there's at least there's a fee in place that it can be utilized and charged out. But the revenue implications are anticipated to be pretty minor over the grand scheme of the total system cost. So just to cap off with a few points, and I think we've already touched upon this a few different times here, but generally speaking, the past practice has left the county in a pretty good fiscal position moving forward. All the calculated rates under either scenarios obviously remain competitive with similar and surrounding jurisdictions. Those scenario 2 rates certainly provide a further benefit to the small township wastewater system, small township systems in order in result of kind of reduced rates as a result of being able to harmonize and consolidate reserve funds and being a little bit more flexible in those in providing services. The rate harmonization, again, provides a more streamlined structure in our opinion. It's easier to administer and understand, sustainable over the long term, it allows the county to be more flexible and nimble to react to project requirements and capital costs, and it allows them to leverage the entire system in order to undertake those projects. So I think that kind of is really the end of my presentation, and I hope this provided county staff and councils with a very good overview of what of the work that has been done. County staff have been really great in providing this input and review of the information. I think this provides a solid foundation to move forward and make recommendations ahead of the council decision, which would be taking place sometime throughout the fall during budget deliberations. Thanks.